All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We try to uh, enlighten you on great different theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, theories of everything, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries from obscure sources. And we try to take you through these step by step. Sometimes these kinds of things can be kind of daunting, and if so, you're at the right place, because we're going to try to hold your hand a little bit, walk you through it, show you some of the ramifications so that you can use these things in your own life for your edification, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your paradigm shifting, your formation of a holistic worldview, your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. And we're just kind of doing an overview right now on this unit called the Reciprocal Church. And the purpose of the Reciprocal Church is to get ready for the inevitable of what's happening, that we're going to need to have some numinosity, some spiritual resources that we can grab onto as kind of all of the Western religions fall by the wayside, as I believe, at least in terms of Christianity and Judaism, research has shown, but has not gotten out to the public yet, that these things have been discredited. The Old Testament we will get into down the road, but basically the Old Testament is just a lot of other stories from other older traditions that have been kind of plagiarized and put into one source, with a heavy dose of what you would call God with a bunch of personality disorders, including jealousness, zealousness, obsessive compulsive disorder, vengeance, anger management issues, and at some point people will have to come to grips with that, and that that doesn't really seem like God with a capital G. And then we've got the New Testament, which according to the evidence that I have seen, is a very, very obvious psyop by the Roman Caesars. And the Roman Caesars had the motives, they had the methods, and they had the means, and they had the opportunity to do this. And we will kind of start getting into that, how that came about. We started that a little bit last time, and we're going to go into that story and then kind of keep going with that. But the basic gist is that the New Testament was written by the Romans, and what I would basically call Team Josephus. Don't know whether Josephus was a real person or not, but if he was on the team. If not, then it was written by a bunch of other Hellenized Jews or Westernized Jews that are living in the Roman Empire, living in Rome at the court of Vespasian, Titus, and then Domitian, the three Flavian emperors from 69 to 96 AD. And they actually wrote, that's why they moved the mythological or fictional life of Jesus back to 40 years before they were actually writing, or maybe even more. But at least 40 years back before they were writing. And then Jesus makes a lot of prophecies in the New Testament that come to be fulfilled in the Jewish war that the Romans were in between 66 and 73 AD. And this was a very damaging war, devastating for the Jews. They lost their temple, and they lost a million or so souls. But the Romans had their troubles too, because the Jews fought hard, and they were getting sick of the Jews fighting so hard against them. And so they proposed a hero, a savior that was quite different from the saviors that the Romans, that the Jews were looking for. The Jews were had prophesied for and were awaiting the military savior who was going to throw off the Romans once and for all and bring all of the Jewishness back to the temple and to Jerusalem and to Palestine in general. And so the Romans wrote about this Prince of Peace who believes in turning the other cheek, walking an extra mile with his 70-pound pack of that he's carrying of the Roman soldiers, and rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, paying taxes. And like I said, they had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. But not only that, but they already did it. They did it once, more than once. The Roman Caesars were really very experienced at creating religions. And that is kind of the stuff I was talking about last time with Yohanan ben Zakkai. Now, Ben Zakkai was a Jewish minister or priest, and well, if he existed, I haven't looked into that, but he was caught in the siege of Jerusalem that occurred in approximately 68 to 70 AD, and he was trapped inside the walls of the city, and he couldn't get out. He strategized with his followers that they were going to carry him out in a coffin, and that way the Roman guards would let him out of the city. And then once he got out of the city, at night he sprung out of his coffin and somehow found some bow and arrow to shoot an arrow with a message connected to it to the Romans that said, "I'd like to negotiate." And he negotiated with the Romans and basically said that we will, if you accept our surrender, we will kind of work for you. And so the Romans hooked him up. The Romans gave him basically like a land grant to start a temple at, I believe it's a place called Jamnia. I could be wrong about that. And but the idea was that the Judaism that was going to be presented at this temple was more of a less of a zealous and militaristic, xenophobic kind of Judaism that was what the Romans were, so wanting to get rid of. But it was a Judaism that was based more on kind of the finer points of the law, digging into all of the little details of the scriptures and, endlessly analyzing them. So it was a kind of a, diversionary tactic to get them to investigate these arcane topics and kind of ignore the fact that the Romans were in complete control of their whole living situation, all of their land, and thereby their temple and all of the various things that went on at the temple. Now, in general, the Romans were very tolerant of other religions. There is a lot of kind of what I would say propagandistic history about Christians being martyred in the first century by Romans. But in general, I don't believe that was true. I think that it was more that Jews were being martyred by them because the Jews were the ones who were revolting. And they were called Christians, but they were Jews. Like James, the so-called brother of Jesus, who is kind of like the foil of the book of Acts, the foil of Paul in the book of Acts, that, Paul is wanting to talk about Jesus's his divinity, that Jesus was the Son of God, and even though I never met him, I saw him in a vision, and but his own brother James was really like, Jesus was a great man, he was a freedom fighter of some kind, but we're still Jews. Paul is kind of like, we're moving away from being Jews. We're wanting to come up with this separate Christianity thing. And so James was eventually executed also, and but Christians will count him as being a martyr of Christianity. Is really he was a Jew. So I think that the level of martyrdom that Christians suffered in the first century was heavily overstated. Maybe in a later period there was more martyrdom, but I would suggest that that is mostly a hoax in general. I know that Candida Moss has a book on that. I haven't read that whole book, so I'm not really totally sure about where she's coming from with that theory. But just from a common sense point of view, I don't see that as being Christian martyrdom. And it's something that's carried over to the present day. Christians still think that they're being martyred. And to a certain extent they are, a lot more today than they were then, I think. But because Christianity, why would the Romans persecute Christians when they believe in turning the other cheek and rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and walking an extra mile with your pack? That's not something that's threatening to them. So that was the whole reason why they came up with Christianity in the first place, is to come up with this idea of this Prince of Peace to mellow out the Jews so that they didn't continue with all of this revolting that they were doing. which was very costly. Another kind of more what you would call cosmetic reason is that, and this has to do with the temple, what the Jews really couldn't stand. Like I said, the Romans were very tolerant of other religions, as long as you rendered unto Caesar, basically. And so the Romans would celebrate your holidays, but they expected you to celebrate their holidays too. And I think the last straw for or at least one of the last straws for the Jews was any time that the Roman Caesars tried to put a likeness, a sculpture, or a statue of one of the Caesars in the Jewish temple, because that goes against the graven images, the golden calf thing from the book of Exodus, and that's kind of the line that they drew. That's once they start putting those images in the temple, then it's pretty much over, and we're revolting. And so that was but kind of a counterpart of that, which was the kind of the vanity of the Caesars, is that these people, these Jews, were so zealous that they didn't fear being killed for this. Apparently the Sicarii, which were the kind of the borderline terrorists that were amongst the zealous Jews, who would really, they would rob and murder their own kind if they felt like they were being too Hellenistic, or Romanistic, westernized. You have to understand that the Greeks controlled Palestine for a long time, and then it was the Romans. So they call them Hellenized. They spoke Greek, but by that time the Romans were there. And what really irked Titus, who was the general at the time of the Romans, who eventually became the emperor, the son of Vespasian, who was also the general. And then once Nero died, there was like a bunch of short-term emperors, and eventually Vespasian became the new emperor, but he was the general fighting this war. And so he gave over the reins of the military to his son Titus while he became emperor. But then eventually Titus won that war, and he became emperor after Vespasian died. And what really irked Titus is that he couldn't get the Jews, he couldn't get the Jews to call him Lord, or to admit that he was the God, that he was God. And many of the Roman Caesars had been, I can't remember the word that they use, but has been when they get divinized, or they're called gods. Julius Caesar was the first one to be called a god, and then Augustus Caesar was also called a god, and then Claudius Caesar was also called a god. And then Vespasian, when Vespasian died, Titus lobbied the Senate for Vespasian to be called a god, which he was. So all of this could even be part of that propaganda campaign to make Vespasian Caesar. But really, in the Gospels, it is Titus that is the Caesar, and then eventually in some of the other later books of the Bible, especially Revelation, it's Domitian that replaces Titus as God. But if you look at the prophecies that are made by Jesus in the Bible, where he talks about how within this generation, which usually for Jews, a generation is, or for the Jews at that time, the generation is 40 years. Within a generation, the temple will be thrown down brick by brick or whatever. There won't be any, all of the different prophecies that Jesus makes about how there's just going to be utter destruction, and everything is going to be lost by the Jews. And Jesus says it in kind of not a vengeful way, but just a prophetic way, like if you don't keep, if you continue down this road, this is what's going to happen. And according to Josephus, that is what happened. He writes, Josephus's writings of the War of the Jews, that especially the stuff where he's talking about Titus and about the siege of Jerusalem, they perfectly fulfill Jesus' prophecies. Now, there's two ways to look at that. You can say, oh, Jesus was divine, and therefore he knew everything, and so his prophecies were fulfilled. Or you could say that those prophecies were already fulfilled at the time that the Gospels were written, and so they knew what was going to happen, and so they included that as prophecies of Jesus. Again, following the logic that Voskillen and Sheldon in Operation Messiah talk about, if there is a common sense, natural explanation for something, then there is no reason to resort to a supernatural explanation for something. And that, if you're saying that those prophecies are evidence of Jesus's divinity, that's what you're doing. There's a very logical explanation for this happening, but you're going with, no, it happened because it was God. So I think that's a very weak, a weak form of proof. Basically, you only believe it if you already believe it, but there is no reason to believe it in the first place. Now, I think that comes most clearly when you're looking at the work of Josephus. Now, most Christians know the name of Josephus because he is really the only source for the existence of Jesus from the first century. I believe Tacitus mentions something about somebody named Chrestus, who was martyred by Tiberius Caesar, which is basically in the right time frame. But Josephus and Tacitus are both very similar in that they were agents of the Roman Caesars. Josephus was supposed to be a Jew, or at least according to his autobiography, he was a Jew and a priest, but he was appointed to be one of the generals, or at least one of the military leaders of the Jews in the fight against the Romans. But eventually he saw the folly of that, and he surrendered. He ended up surrendering to Vespasian. And I was talking about this with Ben Zakkai, the Jewish person who the priest who shot his arrow, and he eventually made a negotiation with, he says Vespasian, but maybe it was Titus. And he gave him the star prophecy, where he said, I see into the future, and I see that you're going to become the emperor. And, that I think goes back to the book of Numbers, and that is you prophesy how this person that you're in front of is going to become a great leader someday. And but the star prophecy was never applied to non-Jews. But in this case, Ben Zakkai applies the star prophecy to Vespasian and says, you are going to become the emperor someday. And lo and behold, when Vespasian does become the emperor, he, honors Ben Zakkai. He gives him this land grant. He gives him the resources to build like a university kind of monastery, kind of prefiguring the medieval monasteries in Europe. And it's in Palestine. And so Ben Zakkai has his ability to develop what they call rabbinical Judaism, which is a much more, detailed upon the law and the scriptures, as opposed to like this military, defense system of the messiahs that the Jews were looking for. Well, turns out that Ben Zakkai was not the only person to give Vespasian the star prophecy. Josephus surrendered also to Vespasian, and in scenes that have many parallels to the Old Testament, including Josephus being buried underground for 3 days and then resurrecting himself. Josephus gives the star prophecy to Vespasian. He says, I see the future and I see that you're going to become the emperor. And when he does that, when Vespasian does become emperor, he honors just Josephus, just like he honored Ben Zakkai, and he adopts Josephus. Josephus becomes the son of Vespasian, the adopted son of Vespasian, and thereby the adopted brother of Titus. And he moves him into the court of the Caesars at Rome. So Josephus, when he's writing about the War of the Jews and his Jewish antiquities and his autobiography, he's living at Rome under the Flavian Caesars. He's one of they're his patron, and so he's going to be writing propaganda, and it's Josephus's writings that the Gospels are totally dependent upon. Really, history is very much dependent upon Josephus. I believe that the Romans pretty much destroyed and or censored all of the histories that we can find from the first century, except for the ones that they wanted to promote, which were Josephus and the Gospels. Those are really the only two sources that scholars had to choose from to figure out what was going on in the first century. So if all of a sudden you tell us that Josephus is a fraud, our whole chronology of the first century is called into question, because in many cases there aren't any other sources. And again, that's why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so important, is because they are another source of what was going on in the first century in Palestine. Arguably at least, many people, and especially the people in the international team of researchers that were appointed to dissect these Dead Sea Scrolls, they tried to distance them from the Gospels, and so they were saying that, these are from the second and first century BC. But there's a lot of evidence that they were not, that they were from the first century AD. And they were coming from the same milieu that the Gospels were coming from. And so anyway, the I guess the point, what I'm trying to get at here, very long-windedly, but I hope I've at least thrown in a few asides that are interesting, is that it's pretty logical to see how the Romans created rabbinical Judaism in order to mellow out the Jews, to get them distracted with all this biblical exegesis, dissecting the scriptures and so on. But what's not so easy to see is that they did the exact same thing with Christianity and with Josephus. Josephus gives them the star prophecy. Then Josephus gets elevated. He gets put into the Roman court. He writes the history, the War of the Jews history and the Jewish antiquities history, wherein much of the Gospels are dependent upon them for not only for dating, but for validation. And then you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Dead Sea Scrolls use a whole lot of language that is also very much echoed in the New Testament, in the Gospels. And so that brings up a question of what did Josephus, I think, clearly knew about, whoever Josephus was, a group of Hellenized Jews that were basically traitors to their faith, and that were working for the Romans. Okay, so now tomorrow, I think what we're going to try to do is introduce typology. A lot of this is coming from Joseph Atwill's two books, Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, and his use of typology, how the Bible and how the ancients in general use typology, and then we can start to see how the typology was used in the Gospels with Josephus. First, we're going to see how the typology is used in the Gospels with Moses. Jesus was a type of Moses. Moses was really, an earlier generation of Savior. And then Jesus walks right in Moses' footsteps, and you can see that typology. And then you can use that as an example to see how that typology is carried on in Josephus. Okay, thanks for tuning in today, and we'll get more focused as we go on, but have a